Welcome to Career and Leadership Real Talk, the no-nonsense guide for ambitious managers who want to have more impact and progress their career. I'm Pamela Langan, a job search coach and expert CV writer specialising in helping frustrated professionals land the jobs and pay rises they know they deserve.
And I'm Jackie Jagger, a leadership and mindset coach specialising in helping newly promoted and new to role leaders to avoid the dickhead trap and lead with confidence. Between us, we've helped hundreds of leaders and managers to find new roles, take ownership of their careers, and handle the challenges that job searches and leadership responsibility inevitably bring. And now we're joining forces to share with you what we know has worked for our clients.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode. Today, we are talking about handling team conflict without becoming the bad guy, because we know that conflict in teams is inevitable at times, but it's really about how you handle it that makes all the difference. So it could be a clash of personalities, misaligned expectations, or competing priorities, but leaders will get it wrong sometimes or become the villain of the piece, or just avoid conflict altogether, which I suppose only makes things worse. So in this episode, we're going to cover how to approach team conflict in a way that builds trust, strengthens relationships, and keeps things moving forward. So a real juicy episode for you this week. So let's just do what we always do and get straight into it. Tell us, Jackie, why or how do leaders get conflict wrong?
I feel like probably the obvious answer to that is examples of when they get it wrong when there is conflict. But I feel like the biggest thing is actually that people try too hard to keep the peace and they avoid tackling the issues because there is a concern that conflict equals combat. So there is this sense that conflict is a bad thing. It's uncomfortable. I don't want there to be conflict within my team. There shouldn't be conflict within my team. And therefore, trying to keep either everybody individually happy or to keep conflict or disagreement from being expressed within the team, I think that leads to avoidance. And I think that's probably the biggest thing that I would say leaders tend to do wrong.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing, isn't it? Because you think you don't want conflict, because if you've got no conflict, then you've got a really happy team. But we've talked about this before, haven't we? But sometimes conflict can be a good thing as well, can't it, within a team?
I remember donkeys years ago as a leadership team, we did a lot of work with the Patrick Lencioni model, the 5 dysfunctions of a team. And one of the things that he talks about in that model and in that book is about the importance of positive conflict. So the absence of trust is the first dysfunction that he talks about. And what that means is that you get artificial harmony because people don't find it safe to disagree or to have conflict. Part of what he talks about is the importance of finding productive and constructive ways for disagreement to be expressed, to be taken as normal, to be considered to be okay. So that becomes a way that people can work within teams for the benefit of the team and not try and avoid it.
Yeah, and I think that probably links into those leaders that might jump in too aggressively as well. So when the conflict is occurring within the team and they almost go into panic mode, we've got to stop this conflict, we've got to put a stop to this right now, and then they just jump in really aggressively. But that can create resentment, can't it, within the team as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Because if you're jumping in, that can sometimes be almost you're trying to rush to the resolution and you're trying to sometimes pick sides or give direction or kind of say, this is it, this is how it's been decided, this is what it's going to be. And that's what can create resentment, because what that then does is leads to you're sometimes taking sides, or you might have favorites or people that you trust their opinion more. And so all of that can cause this kind of building resentment where people don't feel listened to, don't feel that they can express an unpopular opinion. We've talked about psychological safety so many times on this podcast, but that's really the thing, is if you jump in too quickly or go too far, then you lose the psychological safety. And that's the risk that comes with it, is you have resentment, you have things that are suppressed and not brought into the open. And that can be just as challenging as having this kind of false harmony where everyone makes out that they get on, but then the conversations on the side chats on Teams are different to that.
Yeah, and it is interesting, isn't it? When you talk about those side chats, like I think like everybody knows what those side chats look like. But I suppose before we get into what people can do, is there any other things that leaders might get wrong when it comes to conflict?
Yeah, I think another one is that sometimes people will suck it and see. So they'll know that there is some conflict, but they'll struggle to exercise appropriate judgment and make this assumption that, oh, they're adults, they'll work it out for themselves. But if there's not the mechanisms in place, if the evidence historically hasn't been that people constructively handle disagreement or different approaches and work their way through it, then that can be quite dangerous. Because if you assume that someone will work it out for themselves, or a group of people work it out for themselves, and historically the evidence is that doesn't work, then you've lost the opportunity to deal with it in nipping in the bud type fashion. And what that can then mean is that you have to deal with more significant consequences or more significant conflict further down the line. So I think that one is another. And I just feel like overall, one of the biggest challenges I keep coming back to is that sense of that conflict means that there's something wrong, and conflict is combative and conflict is to be avoided. And so I think it's that mindset piece around it that then causes all of these second guessing of yourself as to, do I do something about that? Don't I do something about that? Is that okay? Is it not okay? Are those people going to work it out between themselves, or is this going to blow up a bit further down the line? And I think if you've got that mindset for the team as a whole, where conflict is normal, it's expected, it's part of being a high performing team, is that we have constructive ways to express and resolve conflict, then that means you don't have to get yourself in the middle of it, because the team as a whole has ways to resolve it. So I guess probably very long way of saying, actually feeling like it's solely your responsibility as opposed to a team responsibility is probably the final one that I would pinpoint.
Yeah, and I suppose I think the next thing to touch on is when you feel like there's conflict within your team and you notice it, and then you think, okay, there's some conflict. What do I do next? What's the best way when you recognize that conflict to step in without making it worse?
I think one of the most underused skills in leadership generally, but especially in conflict scenarios in the workplace, is listening. I think the real thing is to be prepared to listen and truly give people the opportunity to be heard. And I think that can be hard to do when you're noticing signs of something that might feel uncomfortable for you, because the vast proportion of leaders that I speak to and work with would say they don't like conflict. They would prefer for there not to be conflict. Conflict feels uncomfortable. So if you know that is the case for you, then there's absolutely that tendency to try and rush to fixing rather than really lean into the listening. And so the number one thing that I would say is really start to listen and understand. So listening gives you that opportunity to know what's the root cause of this conflict, what is the real issue, what's prompting this, where has this come from. And in a previous episode, we talked about the 4 different types of conflict. And I think when you're listening, you can really start to discern the signs of, is this about task conflict? Is this about process conflict? Is this about status conflict? Or is this about relationship conflict? And those are the 4 different categories that we talked about. So essentially, that breaks down into, is it that we don't know what the priority is? Is it that we know what the priority is, but we don't agree about how to make the decision for what process, or, how to achieve that priority? Is it that we don't know who's calling the shots, or there's disagreement, or there's jostling for position about status and who gets to call the shots? Or is this just that kind of personality conflict where there's just niggles and uncertainty? So when you listen, the first thing you can start to do is get that understanding of what is the actual source of conflict that's going on here. And that is crucial if you're going to be able to resolve it without looking like the bad guy.
Yeah, I think that's the key part of it all, isn't it? And we do tend to want to in a situation, and especially if that situation feels a little bit stressful because you don't like conflict, it can be hard to really focus on the listening aspect. And I suppose like what you're talking about there is like listening to get all of the information, to understand all of the facts, and then being able to then separate the facts from the emotions is probably the next stage, isn't it? Because that can be difficult sometimes, can't it?
Yeah, it really can. So there's a difference between what's going on versus how do people feel about what's going on. And conflict is often productive when it's about what's going on and it's focused on finding a solution to a task or finding a way to work through, but it's often unproductive when it's focused on the emotion. So if you think about that personality conflict and those kind of disagreements, how people feel about other people is often more of the source of conflict, more of the source of discomfort than whatever it is that you're working on and might have prompted the original disagreement.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because when you start like looking at it in a little bit more detail, there's a lot more to conflict, dealing with conflict, how conflict can be useful, how it can be damaging. But what else is there that people can do to step in?
So I think when you're making that judgment as to whether or not to step in, you've done that. Hopefully, you've done that observation piece. You've understood what the source is on what's going on. You've understood whether it's about what's happening or about how people feel about it. And I think it's then getting to that point of clarity on what do you need to address and what don't you need to address. So is this something that is impacting morale, productivity, performance of the team, or is it not? Because if you try and jump in to solve something when it doesn't really need solving because productivity and morale and performance are high, you're jumping in for the sake of your own comfort often, to try and get out of that something that feels emotionally uncomfortable for you and that you feel might be uncomfortable for other people. You're trying to get through and out the other side of that quicker. So I think it's really about being clear on what matters. And that then links back to, you can then refocus the team on what matters and bring the team back to, this is not about the comfort or otherwise. It's not about whose idea is the best. It's not about who gets to call the shots. It's that piece of bringing people behind what hopefully matters to all of them, which is that we as a team have a reputation for performing, for doing well, for delivering what we've said we're going to deliver within the organization.
Yeah, I think that there's some really good points there. And I suppose that expectation setting piece is really important, isn't it? Because you need to think about how that's communicated to your team. It's almost like you need a guide to how to deal with conflict within the team, like what happens when conflict comes up. And the podcast episode that we did on the 4 different types of conflict would probably be pretty useful for people to go back and listen to think about what type of conflict is this, and also to educate the team around that as well. So in terms of the right conversations to have and how you deal with the conflict. So you recognize it and you're like, yeah, this is one that I need to deal with. And you have that little heart sinking moment, don't you? And you're like, okay, let's do it. Let's deal with it. How do you get the conversation started? And I suppose what are the right conversations to have?
So, interestingly, just picking up on what you were sharing, I think the most important conversation often is not to be had when conflict has arisen, but is the conversation as a team before there is conflict that does exactly what you were describing, that addresses those questions of what is okay within this team, what is not, what happens when we disagree on an approach, how are we going to handle it? And I feel like that typically is not something that as a leader you set all of that as an expectation. There may well be things that you set as an expectation around what's respectful, what's not, what have you. But I think it's really important to engage the team in that conversation and say, how are we going to handle it so that we can be productive and maintain that ability to facilitate our own way through conflict. So then, if that's there, you've almost got some of those ground rules. But I think when you do then see it as a leader, the conversations that you may need to have would include things like, do you have a conversation one-to-one, or do you have a conversation with the team as a whole? And very often with conflict, because there is that point of listening, understanding, observing, where's it coming from, what's going on, especially if you don't have that group agreement in place, which lots of teams don't, as to how do we handle it when this happens, then it's often really important to have those conversations one-to-one rather than it being discussed within a group, because people will be in a state of high emotion, they will feel defensive, they will feel often unable to express, or they may express things in a way that actually amplifies rather than resolves the conflict that's happening. So I think that's really important, is to make sure it's one-to-one. And I think it's finding that balance of, you've got to be neutral, but not passive. So your role is not to dictate, this is how every piece of conflict gets resolved, but it is to facilitate. So you've got to be the person that can not take that monkey off someone's shoulder when you're having that one-to-one conversation. You're not taking responsibility for resolving it just because you've had that conversation separately. It's very often about, how do you find that way to enable the members of your team to resolve conflict with each other, because otherwise it starts to create that culture of tittle tattle, of somebody will say something and then you will go and try and address it with the other person, and then they will throw a grenade back over the wall and you have to pick that up. So I think it's that sense of, you're having one-to-one conversations and you're being neutral and facilitating and encouraging people to have responsibility and accountability for how they resolve their relationships with other peers and colleagues.
Yeah, and that all makes perfect sense. So I suppose the next thing is about when to step back versus step in, because it is easy, isn't it, to just step straight in? But sometimes you do need to step back, don't you, to do all of the observing, to make sure you're going to handle it right, to make sure you're going to approach those conversations in the right way.
Yeah, and there are some broad guidelines that can be really helpful when you're trying to make that assessment. So if people are clashing, but they're still productive, then don't micromanage it. Don't feel the need to step in just because you feel uncomfortable that this could escalate. Keep the read of the situation, but let them sort it. And some of that might still be about providing that encouragement. It might be really coming back to, what's our team agreement? How do we operate when people disagree or people clash? But it's about not feeling that need to jump in and just resolve it immediately. On the flip side, if what you're seeing amounts to something that is bullying or inappropriate behavior, then you cannot watch and wait. As a leader, if those things are happening, then you absolutely have a responsibility to step in and to address that. Again, it's got to be one-to-one. It's not something that you need to address in that immediate moment in front of a group, but it's almost hopefully two sides of that coin of I can see that there's a bit of niggling here, but it's appropriate. People are addressing it in a way that they've got history and they, have got a way of resolving it. So I'm not going to jump in. I'm going to let them figure it out. But then on the flip side, it's that recognition of, whoa, if something is out of line, that is on me as a leader, and I cannot tolerate or allow that to be tolerated and not picked up. Otherwise, I'm failing in my responsibilities.
And I suppose if conflict is escalating and you can see the morale dropping within the team, or maybe even the work suffering, I suppose that's when you know that you need to act on it, isn't it?
Yeah, so much of this is a judgment call. And I think you've got to accept that you're not going to get it right every single time. I think you've got to be willing to acknowledge that sometimes you will step in a bit too soon. Sometimes you will let things go a bit too far. But the more you can start to understand and exercise judgment, the better that you will get at handling things productively without putting yourself in the middle of the conflict.
Yeah. And then you're always going to have those people in the team that are consistently creating issues, or maybe one person that's doing that. And I suppose this is more about a performance conversation, isn't it, than a conflict issue. So I think you've got to recognize that as well. I suppose it's almost like a decision tree, isn't it? Is this conflict? If it's conflict, what type of conflict is it? Is it going to be helpful, or is this something I need to deal with? And then actually is a performance. And if it's performance, then there's a whole different route to go down with that.
Yeah. And I think people sometimes think of performance as being like technical performance, but actually conduct and people's behavior is part of how they are at work. And that does form part of somebody's performance in the workplace, includes their conduct as well as their capability. And so I think that bit is really key, because I've just known so many times where leaders are a bit hesitant because it's, oh, but actually, I don't really know how to address this, because it's not that they're not delivering their KPIs, but the way they're behaving is not good for the team. Actually, that's impacting their performance as an individual, and it's impacting team performance. So yes, that is for you to step in and to address as being the leader.
Yeah, and I suppose in those situations, it's always easy to go, oh, that's just so, and that's just the way they are. They've always been like that. They're not going to change. And it's no, if they're displaying bad behavior, it's not acceptable, is it? And I suppose that's where you can then like make the judgment on the best way to handle that. So, in terms of some final thoughts or some quick wins, what would you say?
Oh, so I think there's so much involved with this that trying to boil it down to in a nutshell is some kind of quick wins for people. So I think the first is, if you can sense that conflict is going to blow up, then you need to address it early, not by trying to keep the peace, not by trying to avoid it, but to genuinely address it productively. So I think read the scenario, understand it, and address it early rather than have a bigger issue to address later. The second, I would say, is the importance of separating facts from feelings. So, really, that sense of being neutral but not passive, recognizing your responsibility to ensure that the team operates productively, but doing that in a way that facilitates other people to have those conversations and encouraging them to focus on facts and come out of the emotion. And then I think the final thing would be to get really clear on what is, as a team, that sense of how do we want to handle conflict. So if that is not a conversation that you've had as a team, if it's not something that's come up, then I think there can be great value in having that discussion and agreeing what types of conflict might come up, how do we want to handle it, so that you've got that team agreement for how you want to handle it together, and that shared sense of responsibility, as opposed to it just being on your shoulders.
Yeah, and we know that when it's handled well, conflict can actually strengthen teams, and avoiding it or handling it badly can really damage trust and performance. So If you're listening to this and you're thinking, oh, this is something that I want to work on, or you want to get better and navigating tricky team dynamics, then get in touch and we can talk you through some of the options that we've got. We've got some really great team workshops that we run, and Jackie does some amazing one-to-one coaching around this. So get in touch and let us know where you're struggling and how we can help. And as usual, don't forget to rate and review the podcast on your favourite platforms, and we'll be back next week with another episode.
Exciting news from us. If you're an ambitious leader or manager earning 50k or more and you're ready to take your career to the next level, we have an opportunity for you. Introducing Catalyst Career Club, your secret weapon for unlocking career success. As a member, you'll get access to monthly live training sessions, exclusive job opportunities, and the ability to get personalised advice from us on your toughest career challenges.
We've helped thousands of driven leaders like you secure significant pay rises, land dream roles, and thrive in their careers. And now we want to support you in achieving your most ambitious career goals too. Membership is just $6.99 per month with no contract or tie-in. And as a special bonus for being our podcast listeners, you can use the code podcast at checkout to get your first month for just £1. Head over to pamelalangan.com/Catalyst Career Club to sign up now, and we'll see you inside.